If you've ever said, speak English, if you've ever called an immigrant illegal, or if you cheered for walls, bans, or mass deportations, don't you dare celebrate Cinco de Mayo. You do not get to enjoy the flavor of a heritage and culture that you have demonized. No margaritas, no tequila, no tacos, and you don't get to dress up in those little sombreritos and pretend that just for one day that you respect the Mexican culture, when the rest of the year you treat it like a threat. You maggots want to whitewash America? Fine. Then go ahead and celebrate whitewashed holidays. Go to chain restaurants. Eat bland food. Wave your little flags around. But don't you dare toast to a heritage that built this country. You cannot hate the hands that built this country and then raise a glass to their traditions.
I know you are good people. I know you care about due process. You care about the rule of law. And I know in your private moments, when you think about Kilmar Abrego Garcia, and you see that the administration admitted that he was wrongly deported and sent to a prison in El Salvador, that you know that the president should simply correct the mistake. Bring him back home so he can go through the proper court system. When are you going to speak publicly? When are you going to speak out for simple due process, which is the bedrock of our country? Because now it's going from Kilmar Abrego to American citizens, and who knows when it will be next.
All right, guys, so we got to follow up on our coverage of the Democrats boohoo, whining, and crying about the illegal immigrants being deported, okay? Democrats have decided that this is the hill that they're going to die on, protecting illegal immigrant criminals, and in some cases, attempting to take taxpayer-funded trips to foreign countries to rescue the illegal immigrants and to bring them back here to the United States of America, which apparently is something that some Democrats are still planning to do, despite Hakeem Jeffries privately, allegedly telling them that is probably not a great idea.
Jeffries denies that he told Democrats to stop going to Central America. Others are planning trips, including a visit to Honduras.
I'm planning on going, and I think we should continue to go. So I think it makes sense for us to check on them, make sure they're okay. And at a minimum, since there's a multi-million-dollar contract with El Salvador to house these people, shouldn't somebody go take a look and make sure we're getting our money's worth for this?
And yes, every illegal immigrant that comes into this country is a criminal, because coming into this country illegally is a crime, something that Democrats don't seem to understand.
Do you believe that every immigrant here is the same? You can't believe that, because they're not. They're not.
I do.
There's some good, there's some bad. There's some criminals, they're not.
I believe everybody who's here illegally is here illegally. Not all are violent, but all are here illegally.
How do you differentiate if nobody gets a hearing, if you don't have due process? How do you distinguish one from the other? Well, what you're saying is every person that's here in this country is a criminal, is a gang member, should be thrown in jail.
Every person who's here illegally, every person who is here illegally is in fact a criminal. Some of them do come here and commit violent crimes and still aren't deported.
If you don't have a process?
Well, some have records and some don't.
But
I'm
still
here
have
to break the news.
rights.
They're all going away.
Still have constitutional.
So here's the deal. We've let 20 million something people into the country illegally. And now what a lot of folks want to do is use the court system to try to stop as much as possible the rapid deportation of illegal aliens from the country. What the president said in the interview was very clear. He was unsure on these deportation cases because of the unusual circumstances, but he was going to defer to his brilliant lawyers and said, quote, "We are going to follow what the Supreme Court says." There is no outrage here that's worth it. But we have been invaded by millions upon millions of people, and he was elected to get them out. He was elected to get them out. And what some people are proposing is a backlog system that will never allow us to go to get them out.
Illegal. Yeah, so as I mentioned in my last video, the new fear-mongering propaganda tactic from the mainstream liberal media is to basically try to convince people that these illegal immigrants aren't getting quote-unquote due process, or that the illegals are entitled to the same level of due process as an American citizen, which is just certainly not the case. A vast majority of the illegals being deported under President Trump are getting their due process. Liberals just don't like the type of due process that they're getting. And that's essentially what this legal analyst is going to admit to this MSNBC panel when it comes to this conversation about due process, which is that these illegals are getting quote unquote due process, but that doesn't mean that the illegal has to have a hearing and to go to court and to stand before a judge. That's not what due process actually really means. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this.
Review. How is that not a violation of the Fifth Amendment, but suddenly it's a violation of the Fifth Amendment if the Trump administration does it?
Well, the short answer, back then we're talking about immigration law. The Alien Enemy Act is actually not part of immigration law.
So we have three things, and as we said, excuse me for interrupting, but we have the Alien Enemy Act, which the South Texas judges said is illegal. We have what's happened in Venezuela, but then we have general deportation. That's what I'm talking about right here.
Yep. So federal law allows for even broader and speedy removal than has been used in the past. And expedited removal, as you talked about, allows for summary removal. That means no entitlement even to a hearing, possibly within 24 hours. It hasn't been used as broadly as, say, the Trump administration might want to use it, but under the statute, it is permissible to remove aliens who arrive at the border and even those who have been here for 2 years, although that 2-year provision you talked about is the lesser used in practice. But just because it isn't used very often doesn't mean it's not a part of federal law that can be used. And it will be used because it's permitted under federal law. The Congress, in its infinite wisdom, decided that aliens who arrive at the border, and they define people who arrive at the border as people who have even been here 2 years, if they have fraudulent documents, if they don't have sufficient documents, they can be removed in an expedited fashion unless they seek asylum. So you don't run into those due process concerns, at least presumably because that statute, as it exists today, is still valid. Now, that's not...
Yeah, so you seen that, you heard that, okay? What this dude is admitting is that if you come into this country illegally at the border, or you've been here for less than 2 years, you don't get what a lot of people define as due process, right? Like, you don't get to stand before a judge and, state your case or whatever, right? You don't get to do that. You can be removed in an expedited fashion, right? AKA, we verify that you're illegal, right? You're here illegally. You're out, right? You're going immediately unless you claim asylum. Now, this is where the loophole came in from the Biden administration, okay, in which they allowed a lot of these illegals to claim asylum, even though a vast majority of their cases, when they eventually get their quote unquote day in court, they are abandoned, withdrawn, or there's some type of administrative closure, which means that these cases aren't really even going to court, okay? Only 14% of the cases are actually granted asylum, okay? And 16% are denied. So more denied or basically abandoned than cases that actually get accepted. So when you look at those statistics, like, why does it make sense to let so many people in this country illegally, right, and to say, well, they're claiming asylum? If you know there's about an 80% chance that their claim will either be denied or that the process will be withdrawn. Like, it just makes no sense whatsoever. And that is why, me personally, I do not believe that asylum seeking is an excuse to just let somebody stay in the country. They can apply for it. Okay, I think ultimately it's a privilege for them to be able to seek asylum in this country, and they should wait in a third-party country, wait in their home country, or wait in some other country, but you shouldn't be allowed to wait here in the United States of America. It is not a right for you to wait here in the United States of America. But again, Biden essentially gave them that right, to wait in this country, and that's how they game the system, right? That's how they game the system. So again, even the MSNBC legal analysts admitted that illegals, people who come into this country, okay, who cross the border illegally, who've been here for less than 2 years, you can have expedited removal. You don't get to go before a judge and to have a hearing and an appeal and all that stuff. No, you can be deported immediately.
Not what's at stake with the Venezuelans and the Alien Enemies Act. But the government's argument is that, hey, court, listen, you're telling us we need to provide notice. Well, take a look at this federal law. It says that we don't even need to have a hearing. It can happen within 24 hours. So if that's good enough for people who arrive here who are aliens, it's certainly okay for people that the president has deemed to be alien enemies.
And of course, that's been the problem. A lot of the problems with the court is they didn't just go the way Barack Obama did. They did Alien Enemies Act. They went back a couple of hundred years for an act that doesn't even apply now because we're not at war with Venezuela, first of all. And then secondly, again, it's one thing to deport somebody back to their home in Honduras. It's quite another to send them to the most heinous prison in El Salvador.
Yeah, since Joe Scarborough here brought up Barack Obama, let's talk about Barack Obama and due process, right? Because for as much as these people are kicking and screaming and crying about due process for illegal immigrants, where was all this outrage when Obama decided to drone strike an American citizen in the Middle East without due process? And the Obama administration actually used somewhat of a similar legal rationale for why it was okay to kill an American citizen without quote unquote due process, right? Essentially, his legal team argued that, we have deemed that this individual is a part of Al-Qaeda and they are an enemy of the United States of America. And because of that, we don't need judicial review in order to have due process. Executive review fulfills the due process requirement, aka is up to the executive branch to decide whether or not this person's execution is warranted, right? An American citizen. Obama drone strike an American citizen, right? He was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. None of these people cared. But see, it's just funny when a Democrat is in office and they don't necessarily uphold due process. And again, in the case of Obama, he killed an American citizen, right? Without due process. And these people were not as upset about that, right? There was not as much boo-hoo-whining and crying about that and due process. Again, it shows you how much they actually care about American citizens versus illegals. They love the illegals much more than the average American citizen.
And the president has said again and again and in the last couple of days, well, what are we going to do? Have 20 million trials, Danny, for these illegal immigrants? The point you're making is there won't be trials in the sense that we view criminal defense trials. You're going to get the OJ trial 20 million times over if he tries to deport people. So let's take Abrego Garcia, for example. If Garcia comes back to the United States and stands trial or has a hearing, what does that look like as an example of what others might face?
Yeah, Garcia's a little different. He wasn't removed under the Alien Enemy Act because he's not a Venezuelan. And so that whole argument about Venezuela being the enemy or Tren de Aragua being the enemy doesn't apply. But you're absolutely right. If he comes back, what due process is he even entitled to? Well, probably the government will go back to the immigration court and challenge or reopen his case. Because remember, the only thing that kept him here was a withholding of removal order from, I believe, 2019. So they can go back to that court, try to reopen that case and say, hey, since then, he's done some bad things. Now, factually, you can argue, hey, no, he didn't do any of these bad things.
But Danny,
even
that's just limited to don't send him back to El Salvador. They could deport him to Honduras.
Exactly. You make a really good point, which is, again, everyone's saying, hey, bring him back, give him due process. But that due process may mean he can go to any of the other, 200 or so countries other than El Salvador. And that's why I'm cautioning folks. This whole idea of due process, everyone's saying it, well, this is what they're entitled to, the Supreme Court said. But as a criminal defense attorney, I can tell you that due process sometimes feels a little hollow. Going to your point about habeas, I file habeas petitions all the time. It's a slightly different statute because I'm usually dealing with criminal defendants. These are detainees. But the vast majority of habeas petitions are denied without even an evidentiary hearing. In fact, rare is the case where you get an evidentiary hearing. For criminal defense attorneys, any of you watching now, you're thinking, oh my gosh, I got a hearing on my habeas petition, because most of the time they get tossed. And it makes sense because anyone who knows prisoners or the way they litigate, they file a lot of habeas petitions. And your point is spot on. If there was a hearing for every habeas petition, the courts would shut down.
And they know that, right? They know that. That's why they're kicking and screaming and crying about, quote unquote, due process, even though the illegals, they're getting their due process. Are you here legally? Yes or no? Oh, you don't have your proper paperwork? You're not from this country? You came into the country illegally? Oh, you're out, right? That's the due process. What are you talking about? What are you talking about, right? That is due process in and of itself. Due process don't mean they get to stand before a judge and present all their paperwork and they get to appeal and to go through this long drawn out process that takes years. That's not what it means. That's not what it means. But see, what these people think is that illegals should be entitled to the same level of due process as American citizens. That's what they believe. That's what they believe. That's what they're arguing for. They're not arguing for the illegals to have due process. They're getting their due process. What they're arguing for is for illegals to have the same due process rights that you have, that we have as American citizens. They want the illegals to be on the same level as us. That's what they want. That's what they're fighting for. So don't be tricked by this narrative. Oh, Trump is not giving the illegals due process. No. They're getting due process. It's just not the due process that these people like. Prime example, Obrego Garcia. He already had his due process, but they want him to come back and have more due process. It's like, why do you want this dude to have more due process? It was already ruled that he can be deported. So even if you bring him back, we're just going to deport him to another country because he's already had his due process, which says that he can be deported to another country, right? He can be deported. So again, this is what I'm trying to tell you guys. These people, these are not genuine, good faith arguments about, oh, we're concerned about the due process. No, it's a delay tactic, okay? That's what it's all about. It's all about delay. Let's basically try to cancel the results of the election by having the judicial branch block everything that the president tries to do. That's what's happening. That's the strategy. That is the strategy. So this is why I never fall for these sad sob stories. I don't care about what these people have to say about, oh, illegals are not getting due process and all that stuff, because ultimately at the end of the day, in order to right the wrongs of the Biden administration, what they did not follow the rule of law. So if they didn't have a process for it, then at the end of the day, you can't be mad at us for trying to remove the illegals to fix the problem in an expedited way. You can't be mad at us for that, because that's the only way the problem is going to be fixed. And they know that. They know that, but they don't want the problem fixed, right? That's the point. Let me know what you guys think. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Most importantly, share a Black conservative perspective. Peace.